Christmas Eve, 1944. The frozen fields around Bastogne. 3 American soldiers crouch over a small fire at an observation post, warming hands that have gone numb inside gloves that stopped helping hours ago. The fire is tiny, a few inches of orange light in a world of snow and fog. It should be invisible from more than a few dozen yards away. And yet, on this front, in this siege, fires like this one were becoming one of the most dangerous things a soldier could light. To understand why a source of warmth this small could summon death from a mile away, you have to go back 3 weeks, to the moment an entire American division got thrown into the coldest fight of its existence, with almost none of the equipment it needed to survive it. December 19th, 1944. The 101st Airborne Division rolls into Bastogne after an all-night drive north from France, jammed into open trucks with no time to prepare, and, in many cases, no winter gear at all. Within a day, German panzer divisions closed the ring around the town completely. Some 14,000 American airborne and supporting troops, along with roughly 3,000 civilians who chose not to evacuate, found themselves trapped inside a shrinking perimeter, facing a German force that outnumbered them badly and was closing in from every direction. Here's the hinge. This wasn't a summer campaign with cover and concealment built into the terrain. The paratroopers dug into positions like the woods above Foy, a stretch of forest the men nicknamed Jackswood, were doing it in temperatures that fell as low as 19 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit at night, without white camouflage, without proper winter boots, and in many cases without enough ammunition for a sustained fight. One veteran of Easy Company, describing his own foxhole years later, said simply that his feet were wrapped in gunny sacks because there were no gloves and no proper boots to go around. Another remembered his first position as a slit trench so shallow that frost got into it almost immediately, forcing him to dig a second, deeper hole with a roof of tree limbs and packed dirt just to survive the shelling that fell through the treetops above him. Think about what that actually means for a man in a foxhole like that. You are surrounded. You cannot retreat. You cannot resupply. And the temperature around you is cold enough to kill you slowly, even if the Germans never fire another shot. One officer who commanded troops through this siege put it about as plainly as it can be put. It wasn't only 29 days on the ground. It was 29 days in the ground, with no structure whatsoever. Against that reality, a small fire wasn't a luxury. It was survival. And that's exactly the tension this story is built on, because survival and invisibility on this battlefield were pulling in opposite directions. Here's a detail that rarely makes it into the American retelling of this siege, and it changes the shape of the whole story. The Germans surrounding Bastogne were suffering through the same cold, and at least one of them wrote home about it, in terms that reveal exactly how well both sides understood the stakes of staying warm. A German soldier facing the American lines near Bastogne wrote to his wife that the Americans felt the cold even worse than his own men did, because the Americans were lying in their holes without ever having been issued proper winter clothing. Sit with that for a moment. The enemy trying to kill these paratroopers understood, with something close to sympathy, exactly how badly they were suffering from the cold. That's not incidental detail. It's the entire premise of this video in miniature. Because an enemy that understands your suffering, that intimately also understands exactly what you're likely to do about it, and what soldiers do when the cold becomes unbearable and death by exposure feels as real as death by shellfire, is reach for warmth. even when reaching for it might be the last thing they ever do. So how does a fire the size of a dinner plate get discovered by an enemy mortar crew a mile or more away, at night, through fog and snow? The answer isn't mysterious once you understand what German forward observers had spent the entire war learning to look for. By 1944, German artillery and mortar spotters were operating a discipline called flash spotting, a technique refined since the trench warfare of the First World War. 2 or more observation posts, positioned at a known distance from each other, would each note the compass bearing to a flash or point of light. Cross those 2 bearings on a map, and the intersection gives you a location accurate enough to put a mortar round on it. Fire, unlike sound or smoke, doesn't need daylight to betray a position. It announces itself directly, especially against a snow-covered landscape where a single point of orange light stands out with almost nothing to compete against it. And mortars had a particular advantage over other artillery in exploiting this. A mortar shell follows a parabolic arc, a simple curve defined by only 2 points, which meant that once an observer had 2 data points, the flash of the launch and the location of the target it was aiming at, the geometry practically solved itself. Military analysts who study this era of artillery doctrine have noted that this simple mathematics is precisely why mortar positions, despite being small and easy to conceal physically, were disproportionately vulnerable to being located once any kind of visible signature gave them away even once. This is precisely why the German military had spent years developing dedicated countermeasures against their own troops, making this exact mistake. German soldiers were issued charcoal specifically to reduce the smoke and flash produced when they lit fires, and strict camouflage discipline was enforced against exactly this kind of exposure, because the German army understood exactly how deadly a visible fire could be, having used the same detection methods themselves for years, on multiple fronts, against multiple enemies. Sit with the irony baked into that fact. The very techniques that were now being used to hunt American positions around Bastogne were techniques the German army had trained its own soldiers to defend against with almost paranoid discipline. And on the other side of that ring, in the woods and fields around the town, cold, exhausted paratroopers were doing the one thing that discipline was built to prevent, because the alternative was frostbite, or worse, in temperatures that could kill a man just as effectively as a mortar round. Now, here's the part of this story that gives the video its title, and it's stranger than it first appears. German mortar crews weren't complicated tacticians running elaborate triangulation exercises in the middle of a firefight. Most of the time, they were young men, cold themselves, staring out across open fields and tree lines in the dark, and a fire that stayed lit for more than a few minutes was simply the easiest target on the entire battlefield to find. Military historians studying counter-battery and counter-mortar tactics have long noted that crater examination and flash observation, while individually imperfect, become devastatingly effective in combination, because while a single flash sighting might only reveal an azimuth, a second flash from the same fire, minutes later, is often all it takes to close the triangle. A campfire that burns for 20 minutes doesn't give an observer one data point. It gives him a dozen. That's the part that mortar crews themselves, if asked to articulate it in the moment, likely couldn't fully explain. Not because the science was mysterious to them, but because it wasn't a science they needed to think about consciously at all. A fire in the dark, seen twice from 2 positions, simply resolves itself into a location the way a word resolves itself into meaning when you read it. There was no elaborate calculation happening in a German mortar pit outside Bastogne. There was a point of light, and then there was another point of light, and then there was a fire mission. The mortar tube didn't require its crew to understand geometry. It only required them to notice the same glow twice, and the cost of that simplicity was measured in American lives, night after night, across the siege. Casualty figures for the 101st Airborne during the period of the siege run into the thousands, killed, wounded, and missing combined, and losses from artillery and mortar fire falling directly into occupied positions were a constant feature of the fighting rather than an occasional tragedy. One veteran of Easy Company remembered a specific night he called, without exaggeration, the night of hell. The night an artillery round landed directly on a foxhole and killed 2 of his fellow soldiers outright. He spent the rest of that night carrying wounded men to aid stations through the snow. Decades later, another officer from that same company asked how any of them had survived it, could only answer that he had no idea. Picture the calculation a young paratrooper actually had to make in his foxhole on a night like that. Stay cold enough to remain hidden and risk frostbite severe enough to cost him fingers, toes, or his life through hypothermia alone. Or light even the smallest fire for a few minutes of warmth, and risk pulling a mortar round down, not just on himself, but on every man sharing that position with him. There was no version of this choice that came without a price attached. The Germans understood this dilemma perfectly, because it was the exact dilemma their own doctrine had been built to solve on the other side of dozens of previous battles. This is the detail the textbooks tend to skip when they summarize Bastogne as a story of grit and a one-word answer to a surrender demand. The siege wasn't only artillery duels and armored breakthroughs. It was also this, a quieter, more intimate war, fought over the question of whether staying warm for 10 minutes was worth what it might cost you. Some men, faced with that math night after night for weeks, reached a breaking point that had nothing to do with cowardice. One paratrooper later admitted that in his darkest moments in that foxhole, he found himself thinking about his own rifle and how close a single motion would be to ending the suffering entirely. That's not a detail military histories like to dwell on, but it belongs in any honest account of what this particular kind of cold, sustained fear actually did to men. Consider one specific account from a forward observer with the 377th Parachute Field Artillery Battalion. On January 3rd, as fog burned off around the town of Longchamp to reveal a line of German tanks on the hillside beyond, this observer had barely finished calling the location back to his own guns when German return fire found his position almost immediately. He was struck through the mouth by shrapnel in what he later joked was the shortest tour of duty any forward observer had ever served. He survived. But the story illustrates something crucial about this entire front. Exposure of any kind. A voice on a radio, a muzzle flash, a fire left burning too long, invited a response measured in seconds, not minutes. The Germans encircling Bastogne were not slow to react to anything that gave away a position. They had spent years perfecting exactly that skill. For nearly a week, the weather itself worked against the Americans, almost as effectively as the German encirclement did. Heavy fog and low cloud cover kept Allied aircraft grounded, which meant no resupply, no air reconnaissance to counter German observers, and no close air support to punish the mortar crews doing the hunting. It was a false kind of shelter. The same weather that hid German artillery spotters from Allied planes also hid Allied positions from Allied rescue. Then, on December 23rd, the skies cleared. One paratrooper described waking that morning to a sky so blue it looked almost unreal against the endless gray and white of the preceding week, and then hearing, faintly at first, the sound of engines. C-47 transport planes began dropping desperately needed ammunition, food, and medical supplies directly onto the encircled perimeter, and for the first time in days, the defenders of Bastogne had something other than fires to keep them functioning. Cheering troops raced to retrieve the parachuted containers as they fell across the fields around the town. The siege didn't end with that resupply. German pressure continued for days more, and the shelling never fully stopped. But the balance of the deadly arithmetic inside every foxhole finally started shifting back in the Americans' favor. There was at last something other than a small fire to hold on to. December 26, 1944. Elements of General Patton's Third Army finally punch a corridor through the German ring from the south, and the siege that had trapped the 101st Airborne for a week comes to an end. The town held. The division that had been given no realistic chance of surviving encirclement by a numerically superior enemy in temperatures that could kill on their own had done exactly that. But the lesson written into that siege didn't disappear once the fighting moved on. The tension between visibility and survival, between the warmth a man needs to keep functioning and the light that warmth throws off, is as old as warfare itself, and Bastogne is simply one of the clearest, coldest illustrations of it that the Second World War produced. German mortar crews on that front didn't need to be geniuses. They only needed men on the other side of the line who were cold enough to make the same understandable human mistake over and over through a week that never seemed to stop being the coldest night of the war. Go back one more time to that Christmas Eve observation post. 3 men, a fire the size of a dinner plate, hands stretched toward it in the dark. That fire wasn't recklessness. It was the ordinary human need to survive a cold that was trying to kill them just as surely as the army surrounding them. And on nights like that one, across an entire siege, that same ordinary need was exactly what German mortar crews, without ever needing to explain the physics of it, learned to watch for. It was never really about triangulation, or flash spotting, or the parabolic arc of a mortar shell. It was about a fire, glowing in the dark, doing exactly what fires have always done, giving away the people who need it most. If you want to see what happened when the roles reversed, when it was German positions giving themselves away to Allied artillery through the same mistake on the same front just weeks later, that's a story for another video, and it's coming next.